Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, does he still want to close the wage gap with Australia? And if so, what role does he consider unions will have in closing that gap?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes, unions will have a role in assisting to boost productivity in the workplace so that the economy can sustain higher wages. And in fact, the government has committed about $1 million to a productivity program that has been started actually by the dairy workers and someone else. I just can't remember who the other union was. What I can say is that legislating higher wages in the long run won't work.
Materia Today.
Thank you. How will restricting union access to workplaces help to narrow the wage gap with Australia?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the government has put a number of amendments in front of the House, including not restricting union access, but changing the way the decisions are made about union access to the workplace. There's no doubt about that. We believe that package will assist with a more flexible and productive labour market, and that is vital to closing the gap with Australia.
Materia Today.
Who exactly is pushing this policy to restrict union access to workplaces, given that even Business New Zealand thinks it's a very low priority?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's one measure among dozens that the economy, that the government is taking, which we believe in the long run will lift the strength of the economy. I mean, the amendments, like the other ones in the industrial relations package, were put forward by the national-led government.
Materia Today.
Would it not be a quicker pathway to the closing this gap on wages between New Zealand and Australia if the Minister would agree to indexing the minimum wage to the median wage so that the lowest paid workers in this country can share in the benefits of the productivity that he talks about, closing the gap between rich and poor? Or does he consider that it's okay for productivity increases to enrich the rich and continue to impoverish the poor?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think that productivity increases historically have had probably the opposite effect, and that is the one way in which you can raise the living standards of those on lower incomes. The fact is, if you could just stick the minimum wage to $20 an hour, I suppose, and that would make some people better off. It's just that it would also drive hundreds, if not thousands, of small businesses out of business and exclude thousands of New Zealanders, particularly young New Zealanders, from the workforce altogether. We all know there's trade-offs around minimum wages, and simply legislating higher minimum wages doesn't get rid of the risk to businesses being able to continue and the effect of locking particularly young workers out of the workforce. And that matters now because the number of young workers as a proportion of the unemployed is higher than it has been for some time.
Materia Today.
Does the Minister not know that increasing numbers of low-waged workers, ordinary New Zealand workers, like drivers and labourers and machine operators, are heading to Australia because the minimum wage there is the equivalent of $19.74 New Zealand dollars an hour, and because unions have played a long-term part in strengthening working conditions for those lowest paid workers?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, yes, I am aware of some New Zealanders crossing the Tasman to an economy where wages are somewhere between, anywhere between 10 and 30% higher, and that is a continuous challenge for New Zealand. We've taken some recent steps to help close up that gap and to make New Zealand a more productive option. So, for instance, someone who is driving a truck is now paying a top statutory tax rate of 17.5 cents in the dollar, which is quite low, and it means if they do another hour of overtime they get to keep 82.5 cents of it. And we believe that improving the incentives for workers right across the income range is important, and we've taken probably the biggest step that a government has for a long time to improve their incentives.
Materia Today.
Does the Minister not care that we are losing ordinary New Zealand working families just trying to have an ordinary working life, either to higher wages in Australia or to poverty here at home because of his government's failure to take basic steps to increase the minimum wage for lowest paid workers?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, of course I do care about that, as the government does, and I think the member cares about it, and maybe even the Labor Party cares about it. At the moment, the biggest challenge in this economy is to undo the damage of the excesses of the last decade, where too many of those families were reliant on jobs that were funded by debt, and that is not sustainable. Too many of them were reliant on jobs that were funded by excessive government spending, and that is not sustainable, and we are turning that around.
Sue Kedgley.
Does he think it fair that the majority of caregivers who work in aged care and look after some of the sickest and most vulnerable New Zealanders with complex health needs are amongst the lowest paid workers in New Zealand and do not get any additional pay or overtime or penal rates when they're required to work at nights or in weekends?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member is probably aware of a court case with respect to the work at night. But yes, these people are among New Zealand's lower paid, and I'm quite surprised that after a decade of Labor being in office, they did virtually nothing about it. In fact, all the wage increases in health, under Labor went to the highest paid health workers, not the lowest paid. And I cannot understand the logic of that.
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Does he agree that when he took over as Finance Minister, New Zealand was in a reasonable position in dealing with the uncertainty of our economic outlook?
No.
The Honourable Bill English.
No, Mr Speaker, I don't, because actually what the problem when we took over was, first, the economy was in recession, secondly, inflation was at over 5%, and thirdly, households had massive debt, and fourthly, government spending was out of control. The one factor that has worked for us is relatively low government debt. The rest of it was a mess.
Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
I seek leave to table a statement of the Honourable Bill English of the 18th of December 2008. I want to stress that New Zealand starts from a reasonable position in dealing with the uncertainty of our economic outlook. It's a report in the New Zealand Herald, sir. Direct quotes from the Minister of Finance.
Order. Members know we're not tabling press statements or newspaper clippings. Question number 9, the Honourable Steve Chadwick.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Conservation.